Hi, this is storyteller Mitch. I'm reading from a short story anthology, a very old one called The Best of Science Fiction Monthly. It says here that the exciting collection of short stories is taken from Science Fiction Monthly, New English Library's popular SF magazine launched in January 1974. This would have been printed in, I'm just going to check, 1975. So very old book. And I'm reading a short story from it called A Woman Naked by Christopher Priest. The crime was sexual promiscuity. The punishment was probation. Now she walked to the courthouse for her appeal, a woman naked. It was midday and the streets of the city were crowded. Mistress L walked at a steady pace, knowing that the court would not admit her before the appointed time, and that the distance of the walk had been carefully measured so that if all went well she would not have to wait more than a few minutes at the court. She knew also that if she ran she would only attract more attention to herself, even as she wanted to shorten the agony and humiliation of this obligatory display of her moral weakness. Already she had attracted a small crowd of men who were following her. She had no way of knowing what their intentions were, but she hoped that all they wanted was to look at her. If the worst happened, and it was not likely, she knew that there would be no one to help her, even though her brother and his friend were walking a few yards behind. There was no penalty for the rape of a woman naked, but the punishment was severe for anyone who tried to protect her. A convicted promiscuous woman had by her actions admitted to her consent. 6 months she had survived as a woman naked, not by good fortune alone, but also by the care of sympathetic friends. She did not envy those women who were forced to pass their probation in the cities. In this she had been lucky, even had been those friends who had inadvertently initiated the crime. Remorse was long past, and she sought now only to return to normal life. The shame had been temporarily revived by this day, but on the whole she had learned to live with it. The fear persisted, the terror of sexual violation. She had grown up in a society where morals were legislated, for women at least, and accepted its standards, but there would be no growing accustomed to the daily fear of assault that had been hers during the probation. The law protected those women who were chaste, monogamous, faithful to their husbands. It punished severely those who betrayed. Sometimes during her probation she had thought uselessly of the nature of her crime. Just 3 men, but the member was irrelevant. Cognizance of the number involved did nothing to lessen the severity of her plight, but it had indeed been just 3 men. 2 if she discounted her husband. The first of her extramarital crimes had been a brief, casual acquaintanceship, consummated and concluded during one night. After that she had worried, knowing the penalty for adultery, but with no passing time she allowed it to recede into insignificance. It had been a long time ago. 4 years? 5? She had now covered about half the distance to the courthouse. The law laid down that one day the appeal of a woman naked must cover the distance from the probation registry office to the court, alone and on foot. There would be no evasion of this. Cameras monitored the whole route. If she deviated from the route, in fact or in spirit, her appeal might not be heard. The probation could be extended indefinitely. Behind her a small crowd of men followed in silence. About 2 years ago she and her husband had entered a new circle of friends. Her husband had a small talent as a painter, and he had hoped that by meeting people connected with the professional, literary, and artistic world he might gain recognition. The people they met styled themselves as free thinkers, intellectual radicals in a society where conformity was fashionable. They derided the moralistic laws, claimed the privileges of humanism and self-expression, and in their company both she and her husband had allowed themselves to believe that the laws may indeed have no real effect. It was in this mood of affected radicalism that she had met the third man. One evening, while the others were debating some minor political issue, he had taken her to another room and given her some illicitly distilled liquor. Later he seduced her, and afterwards she rationalized her actions as a radical statement against the repressive laws. Within a week she was arrested. She came to a street intersection and had to wait by the curb until the traffic allowed her to cross. At her side was a pillar bearing one of the court television cameras. The crowd of men waited behind her. They did not come too close, for which she was thankful, but she wondered if they were waiting for a more opportune moment to close in on her. As she crossed the street, she passed a group of women. They glanced at her, then looked deliberately away. No sympathy, not even a flicker of understanding. She wanted to call out to them to help her, perhaps to walk with her as far as the court, but there was never any help for a woman naked. While waiting for the trial, it had become clear to her that one of the group of her radical friends must have been a police informer. It was this knowledge which frightened her, for when her husband left her, she realized she was on her own, as she had no conception of whom the informer might be. She dared not ask friends for help. During the trial, none of them appeared in her defense, and the prosecution evidence was given in secret, such a privilege of the male. After verdict was announced and she was given the temporary name Mistress L, she returned to her apartment and for a week tried to carry on a normal life. She stayed inside, ordering food by telephone. She felt the emptiness of the flat, her husband and all his possessions gone. It was too difficult, too lonely. She could not leave without burying herself, and knew that if she did, she was caught. Her punishment would become permanent. Every footfall in the corridor outside became that of a violator. Every man who paused for more than a moment beyond her window became a potential rapist. The streets of the city became, in her mind, a maze of darkened alleyways and lurking shadows. Finally, with no one else to turn to, she took off her clothes and drove over to the home of her nearest friend, taking the chance that it was not he who had been the informer. In fear of some further kind of betrayal, she asked his help, and to her surprise he had been willing and able. Someone he knew had a large house in the country, some 50 miles from the center of the city. It would be possible for her to serve her sentence there. Once away from the city, she felt safer. She still had to bear herself in public, and for the first few weeks was the center of considerable local hostility, but she felt correctly, as it turned out, that in the countryside there was less chance of being attacked. Her brother heard of her plight and visited her several times. He could help her no more than anyone else, but he provided her with company. Towards the end of the probation, a new frustration arose in her. She had lived all her life in the city, and the sight of the countryside beyond the grounds of the house tantalized her with its beauty. Once she went for a walk with her brother, but a woman naked is recognized everywhere. So the probation passed. No one attacked her. Her body remained inviolate. On the last night of the probation, she returned to a city apartment with her brother and his friend, and in the morning she reported to the probation registry office. From there, the 3-mile walk to the courthouse. She realized that some of the men behind her were talking. This was a hopeful sign. Her brother had told her that he and his friend would do whatever they could to keep the inevitable crowd from becoming a mob. Silence, he said, was dangerous. If an attack had begun, some men would be self-conscious in a crowd of others, but they would be in a minority. In silence, there would be tacit approval by the majority of any direct movement towards her. Now she heard a few remarks about her body, and they were, in general, good-natured. She knew that her brother would be trying to initiate a verbal response to her appearance. A man stepped forward from the crowd and walked for a few paces at her side. He glanced at her, appraising her body, but she stared back at him to meet his gaze. At once he took away and turned from her, heading into a shop doorway. All her life she had lived with an apparent awareness of the realities of sexual vulnerability. As a child she had been taught to be demure and modest, to respect her father and brother, to beware of men she did not know. Later she had followed her mother's advice and only mixed socially in large groups of people. She was not unusual in this. She was made her own friends and talked to them. She discovered that they had been brought up in the same fashion. Only as she became an adult in her own right did she fully understand the reasons behind this. That men outnumbered women several times over, and then although by nature of her sex she was accorded special treatment in society, it was only so long as she lived by society's rules. There was none so sweet as an innocent woman. There was none so guilty as one who erred. At least the courthouse was in sight, and still a crowd of men behind her remained small. She wondered if they were the same men who had been following her from the beginning, or whether the number had stayed constant while individual men had come and gone. As she had done so often before, she thanked the chance that had allocated to her daytime hearing. The newspapers, although not too caring about the fate of a woman naked, often published news items reporting the rape and murder of a woman naked on her way to nighttime probationary appeals. Until her own arrest, she had taken not much notice of the affairs of convicted women, assuming that it was a fate that would never befall her, but on the realization of her own prospects, she became aware of just how much she really did know about the punishment, and what was likely to happen to the offenders. She knew, too, that the form of the present appeal would take. She glanced over her shoulder. The crowd had mainly dispersed, perhaps understanding where she was heading. She saw her brother and his friend walking along the 10 yards behind her in a group of about a dozen other men. The worst appeared to be over. Now she was within a few hundred yards of the courthouse. She felt less conspicuous, had grown accustomed to the feeling of walking naked through the streets. The other women naked, she wondered, did they too grow accustomed to it, or did they stay behind closed doors as she had done? The court building stood in a small square, the center of which was laid out in the form of a garden with many overhanging trees. She passed through these, leaving behind the sound of the traffic and most of the crowds. Once more she looked behind. In addition to her mother and his friend, only 5 men followed her. The entrance to the appeal court was at the side of the building, and she turned the corner and walked down the narrow passageway, where she discovered that a crowd of about 40 men were clustered about the door. Her brother stepped forward and walked by her side. As he pushed her way through the crowd, he stayed at her side, trying not to appear to be with her. That too was covered by the law. Women naked were supposed to report to the court unaccompanied, though she surmised that a few women took that risk if there was someone willing to help them clandestinely. She noticed that standing beside the door was another girl. She was very young, hardly out of her teens. Naked, she faced a wall, trying to shield her body from the hands that reached out to touch her. The girl saw Miss Giselle approaching and looked at her with relief, but at that moment the door opened and a man in a uniform appeared. "You're next," he said to the girl. He helped her through the door, and Miss Giselle moved forward. "What about me?" "After her. You're early." The door closed, and Miss Giselle turned to face the crowd. She discovered that by staring at the men's faces she could avoid provoking them. By her side her brother stood facing her, trying to behave like the other men, yet standing convulsively in their way. They seemed not greatly interested in her. Perhaps she was older than they would have liked her to be, or feared consequences of an attack on her on the steps of the courthouse. Why then were they all here at all? Simple voyeurism? A few stood away from her, talking in small groups. She hated all of them, seeing them for what they were, the men who had no place in society, yet who took advantage of the rejects from that society. She knew that if they decided to attack her, here or anywhere else, she would die. There were too many of them, and they were not organized in any way. They would scrap and kick for her body, and in the confusion they would destroy her. But they seemed not greatly interested in her, and the minutes passed uneventfully. The door opened and the man appeared once more. "Name?" "I'm known as Miss Giselle." "That's right, you're next. Wait here." The door closed again, and she realized that the men in the crowd were looking expectantly at it. Another minute passed, and then the door opened again. The young girl appeared, still naked. The doorman thrust her roughly down the steps, and she fell. "Come in, you," he said to Mistress L. She looked down where the girl lay and up at the crowd of men who were moving in on her. "But in." Her wrist was seized, and she was dragged through the doorway. As the door closed, she heard the men shouting, and over it the girl was screaming. "What happened?" "She lost her appeal. This way." She was taken along the short corridor towards the flight of steps, and that at the bottom of these was a small anteroom. The doorway showed her what was inside. "If you win your appeal, you dress in here. What if I don't? I'll conduct you safely to the exit." Inside the room were several racks of clothing. Each of the garments was a one-piece gray dungaree made of rough, badly cut material. She nodded towards the steps. Up there. She ascended them slowly. At the top was a narrow platform raised high over the courtroom. There was a narrow rail, and she gripped it. The court of the appeal was assembled below. The courtroom was approximately fan-shaped, with a raised platform in which she stood at the apex. There was none of the air of the formality she had anticipated. The seats were facing her arrangement in the manner of the auditorium, and people moved about, some talking quietly in the background. The first few rows of seats were packed tight with the members of the public, and immediately behind these was an enclosed section in which sat the various court officials and dignitaries. Beyond this were more seats, but not of these were occupied. Everyone present was male. 2 lights were concentrated on the platform, and they blinked in on the sudden dazzle. In the judiciary section, a man stood up and spoke almost inaudibly over a background noise. The Court of the Appeal is in session. Slowly, silence fell. The Court of Appeal is in session to hear the representations from the woman currently known as Mistress L. Would the appellant identify herself? I am Mistress L, she said, and she realized that one of the side of the courtroom recording machines were turning. Very well, for I am your counsel. To establish your appeal, I have to obtain from you a statement. You are reminded that the oath you swore at your previous trial is still binding. Is that understood? Yes, sir. The nature of your appeal is in the form of a sworn confession. You must relate to the court the details of your crime. Your account will be compared with the sworn testimony of the prosecution witnesses, and if any of it differs, you will be called upon under cross-examination to account for the discrepancies. If you are not able to satisfy the court as to the authenticity of your confession, your appeal will not be upheld. Do you have any questions? Yes, sir. What degree of detail does the court require? Your statement should be complete to every last detail. Your every thought, move, and desire. You must describe minutely the experiences you had and how you reacted to them. Leave out no detail, however trivial it might seem to be. He sat down. Please begin. Mistress L was the focus of all attention. She opened her mouth and started the account of her crimes. The rape had begun. And that's it for this story. Thank you for listening.